We'll spend a couple of moments here just making sure everything's online. This earlier tonight, we had another family meal of soup. And I made Preacher's cheeseburger soup tonight. I know some of you in the past who have followed in and you've asked for my recipes, and I can sure get that to you. You can always email me at olsonmark1966@gmail.com. olsonmark1966@gmail.com. I just got the heads up from my wife that we are indeed streaming now. So welcome to the Bible study on the book of Ruth. Tonight is just an introduction. Next Thursday, we'll gather again. We're at 7:36. Sorry, I'm a little late. Had a little technical difficulties here with the Facebook live streaming. Kind of had to retrain myself. I haven't done this for a few weeks. If you want to, and this is certainly up to you, you don't need to order background materials or books. The Bible study outline that I'm going to be following and some of the questions comes out of the Book of Faith Initiatives, Ruth. This is the learner guide, and that's really all you would need. The Ruth Bible study, it's got some places to write your own thoughts and the margins and reflections and kind of make this study your own. One of the difficult things about this medium, and if I see Marianne Erickson is on, if you want to respond with a question or something, I'll do my best to try to reply to that. But unfortunately, rather than sitting around a table and having kind of dialogue around Bible study, I'm afraid this medium is more monologue, just listening to me. But having this resource in front of you and writing in it can be helpful. It's available on from Augsburg Fortress. It's also available on Amazon.com. Augsburg Fortress, Ruth Bible Study, and you're going to want to enter in Diane Jacobson. You can get it for about $5 off of the Augsburg Fortress site, and then Amazon, I think, is about $9 or $10. And then for those who want to go deep into the background, this is again entirely up to you. It's a commentary by Dr. Catherine Dubs-Sakenfeld. Ruth, an Interpretation Bible Study. It's really good. It's very small. It's only it's less than 100 pages. And Ruth is a short book. It's 4 chapters, but we may actually spend more than 4 weeks as we go through it. We were using this as a Bible study on our Thursday morning group, and there were days when we would get through 1 page in the Jacobson study guide, just because the conversations were so fun and enriching. Anyway, the Sakenfeld Ruth study is available also on Amazon. Nice thing about that is you can get it in Kindle form too. So, why study the book of Ruth? And again, this is just a basic background and introduction. Ruth's a really interesting book in the Old Testament in that it falls right in between the book of Judges, which is violence and men behaving badly, and corruption and anger and deceit, and then we get into First Samuel, which is again the history books. 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles are again lots of men behaving badly. Violence, oftentimes things don't go as one would hope or one would plan. And right in between there is this little book of Ruth where women seem to be behaving well. And it's, as I'll get into later, sometimes it's called the happily ever after book of the Old Testament, where community and relationship and fidelity hangs in there, and bridges are crossed, and different ethnic groups find tranquility. And it's just, I think, an amazing book to consider at a time like this. It's a story written for a time of famine, of plague, of death, with a hopeful ending. And I think as we're going through a story that we don't know what the ending is yet, it's nice to find that strength, that support, and that witness in the book of Ruth. One other third commentary, and please I don't expect you to all to pick up on this. This is more some of my background and preparation. Is I found a really good commentary by L. Daniel Hawk, the Ruth Apollos Old Testament Commentary Series. And Stephen, great to see you back with us. Welcome to the conversation. Anyway, in his introduction, he identifies some just really neat ways of encapsulating what is the conflict, what's going on in the book of Ruth. And first and foremost, the conflict is this: Ruth is a Moabite. She is a foreigner. And now, as the story unfolds, she finds herself living in Bethlehem, the city of bread. Naomi had fled with her husband, the city of bread, Bethlehem, because of lack of bread. And they had found refuge in Moab. And Ruth attaches herself to her mother-in-law. Great story. Hey, Rachel, welcome. Great story of people across cultures, across divides, finding oneself in a time of famine, in a time of separation, a time of pandemic, one might even say, and gathering in hope. Conflict. Ruth is a Moabite. She's a foreigner. Now she's living in Israel's Bethlehem. L. Daniel Hawk writes, Ruth the Moabite enters Israel's social and geographical space, uninvited and probably unwanted. The ensuing drama grapples with the import of the foreigner's presence among the descendants of Jacob. What is she doing here? How should Israelites deal with outsiders who attach themselves to their nation and to their God? That's essentially the conflict that underlies Ruth. You also need to know that the book of Ruth has other places where it is in conflict with the Old Testament witness. Ezra and Nehemiah are two books that write about racial and ethnic purity amongst the people of Israel. And Ruth has to battle against a bad name that the Moabites have in the name in the land of Israel. Sometimes we make those names up about others, whether they're even within our own Christian tradition, oh, those darn Catholics, oh, those Baptists, and we love to make jokes about each other. You know how many Baptists you take fishing with you, right? 2, because one will drink all your beer. Well, that's not very nice to Baptists. It might be funny, but it's a stereotype. In the same way, the Jews hated the Moabites as much as earlier they'd hate the Philistines and later the Samaritans. Lots of racial tension occurring here in the biblical witness. Gladys, welcome. Good to see you joining our group too. Here's the essential beginning of the conflict between the people of Moab and the people of Israel. It dates back to when Lot flees Sodom and Gomorrah. His wife is turned into a pillar of salt, and they find refuge in a cave. Now, Lot went out to Zoar and settled in the hills with his 2 daughters, for he was afraid to stay in Zoar. So he lived in a cave with his 2 daughters. And the firstborn said to the younger, Our father is old, and there is not a man on earth to come into us after the manner of the world. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, so that we may preserve offspring through our father. So they made their father drink wine that night, and the firstborn went in and lay with her father. He did not know when she lay down or when she rose. Must have had a lot of wine. And on the next day, the firstborn said to the younger, Look, I lay last night with my father. Let us make him drink wine tonight also. Then you go in and lie with him, so that we may preserve offspring through our father. So they made their father drink wine that night also, and the younger rose and lay with him, and he did not know when she lay down or when she rose. Thus, both the daughters of Lot became pregnant with their father. The firstborn bore a son and named him Moab. He is the ancestor of the Moabites to this day. And the younger also bore a son named Ben-Ami. He is the ancestor of the Ammonites to this day. So right there, already in this beginning of the introduction of this study that will continue over the coming weeks on the book of Ruth, we have an animosity and a tension and an illegitimate, if you will, upbringing of the people of Moab. Deuteronomy 23 talks about racial purity amongst the people of Israel. Those born of an illicit union shall not be admitted to the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. None of these descendants shall be admitted to the assembly of the Lord. No Ammonite or Moabite shall be admitted to the assembly of the Lord. So there it is in the Deuteronomical codes, even to the 10th generation, none of their descendants shall be admitted to the assembly of the Lord. So then why the story of Ruth? Why the book of Ruth if there's all this separation and this desire, at least in some respects in the Old Testament witness, for racial and ethnic purity? Ruth is one of the four women that are named in the genealogy of David and then the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew chapter 1. There's Bathsheba, Tamar, Rahab, and sorry, I shouldn't be doing this off the top of my head. Tamar, Rahab, and Ruth. They're the four women who are not women of Israel, who are not part of the patriarchy that's listed there. And so Matthew is taking and making a theological statement that the blood that Jesus sheds for the world, he gets from the world. And here's the witness in Rahab and Tamar and Ruth and Bathsheba. Again, in that commentary that I mentioned towards the beginning here, Daniel Hawk, he also lays out that these are the parallels or the conflicts that will whip back and forth throughout the narrative is a comparison or contrast to the world of women, the world of Naomi and Ruth versus the world of men, the world of Boaz and those who work the fields of Bethlehem. There is the contrast between familiar space, the land of Bethlehem, versus foreign space, the land of Moab. What does it mean to be an ethnic insider, a Judean, versus an ethnic outsider, a Moabite? I said earlier that still goes on in our own faith traditions, and sometimes we point the finger again at Catholics or Baptists or thus forth. We also do that in terms of our interfaith relationships. I work particularly in Native American communities, in the Ojibwe community. Well, you must be Mede, traditional, or you must be Christian. There's also a sense of racial or religious purity. And what does it mean for us, Gichimanedu, Wakantanka, Yahweh, one God with many names, to seek and find support and strength and unity in that? I think Ruth speaks to that as well. One other conflict, and I'm just about ready to sign off here because this is just an introduction tonight. I expect that we'll go 25 minutes, half an hour with the various sessions going forward. But we're already up to 15 minutes. And I think one of the really neat points of potential conflict, or maybe it's two sides of the same coin, is the book of Ruth a story about human agency? Is this a story about the grit and the determination of a Naomi and a Ruth and the forbearance of a righteous man like Boaz? Is it a story of grit, of human agency, or is it a story of the divine providence of God? Again, the Sekenfeld commentary. This one is really fun to read because Dr. Sekenfeld is Presbyterian. And the whole doctrine of God's providential care and protection runs through her interpretation of the book of Ruth, very thick, that indeed God's providential hand is on Ruth and Naomi, and that's the determining factor here. And indeed, if we look at the salvation history of Matthew 1 and the coming of Jesus, one could certainly bear that argument out, that this is really a story about God's providence. But it's also a story, I think, of the grit and the heroism and the determination of two women who are drawn together and don't give up. Two women of great grit. As Lutherans, in particular as a Lutheran pastor, I believe often in the hiddenness of God. God is revealed in the cross, and God is also often not revealed always in the happily ever after things of our life, but rather hidden under suffering. Again, that Romans 5 understanding that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character. Character produces hope, and hope doesn't disappoint us. And sometimes that pattern of suffering and what it leads to isn't evident. We're living in a time of where we don't know the ending. Ruth's story has a happy ending, but it's also a story of death. It's also a story of famine and migration and hunkering down and hiding and seeking hope in family. And so that whole understanding, is this an act of their unique human agency? Is this really an act of God's providential love? Can speak to us when we really don't know the ending yet of the situation we're in. But how great to see two gritty characters who are in a difficult time together, and they find the strength to meet the days to come. So next week when we get to working into the story, some things to think about. First of all, read for chapter 1. That's where we're going to begin next week. And just to have an understanding of the totality of chapter 1. If you want to read the whole sitting of Ruth, you can do that in a matter of an hour or two. But chapter 1 will go rather quick, 10, 15 minutes. And that's really taking time and attention, because we're really looking at only about 20 some verses. Ask yourselves, and you might want to write these things down. What do you hear? What do you notice? What stands out to you when you read the narrative? What words or phrases capture your attention? Might even ask you next week to type those in the comments. And the second thing is reflect on any migration story that you may have. Have you ever lived in a place other than where you were born and raised? And if so, what mode? And if you have and lived somewhere afar, maybe in a separate country or somewhere out of kind of the Scandinavian, Northern European areas of the Upper Midwest, or you moved maybe off of the White Earth or the Leech Lake or the Red Lake reservations and onto kind of those areas where you've had to cross boundaries. What motivated you to move? And what was that experience like of crossing cultures and boundaries? I'm going to close. I've been listening to and reading and reflecting on a lot of podcasts lately. And I want to close with, I was even earlier today listening to a reflection on the life of Winston Churchill, and how he led the people through a very difficult time to find that sort of grit and that British guile and strength. And when he gave his their finest hour speech, I'm going to quote just the end of that, but I want to set it up a little bit by saying this. The people, and when the raids were coming, the Blitz, if you will, was coming down in the beginning of the Battle of Britain, and the bombing of London and many of the other cities. The situation was bleak and uncertain. Hitler's armies had swept across Europe. France lay defeated. The British troops had made a miraculous escape from Dunkirk, and the morale of the British people was that of defeat and disunity, anger at leaders. Neville Chamberlain is been gotten rid of as the prime minister, and Winston Churchill emerges into power at this time. Interestingly, Churchill doesn't point fingers. He doesn't point fingers at the other leaders or the soldiers or the generals. In fact, here's a brief comment from his speech. Of this, I am quite sure, that if we open a quarrel between the past and the present, we shall find that we have lost the future. And so Churchill isn't willing to point the finger and pick quarrels with what should have been done or what might have been done or what should be doing right now, but rather let's get prepared for what will become the Battle of Britain. And this is the closing paragraph. Churchill is writing at a different time and uses and lifts up the language of empire. And as we know, empire language has all sorts of difficulties, particularly when empires go in and take indigenous land. So a bit of an exception for that. But in the history of the time, when Nazi Germany is rattling their swords on the far side of the English Channel, and all seems to be lost, these words brought great conviction and hope. Can't do the British accent, sorry. The Battle of France is over. I expect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin. Just as our battle with the coronavirus is, we're right in the teeth of that battle right now. I expect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin. Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. Upon it depends our own British life and the whole continuity of our institutions and our empire. The whole fury and might of the enemy must be very soon turned to us, as it was. Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be free and the life of the world may move forward into broad, sunlit uplands. But if we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age, made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the lights of perverted science. In that perverted science, the British knew what was happening in the concentration camps and the experiments with Jewish children. More protected by the lights of perverted silence. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will say, this was their finest hour. I sure hope that 1,000 years from now, when people study the year 2020 and the great pandemic that swept across the world, when we might looked upon from a place far off in the seat of history, that this was humanity's finest hour. Women like Ruth and Naomi, women who faced poverty and isolation and death, can speak to us too in this uncertain times. Their courage and their leadership can inspire us also in what might be our finest hour. In Jesus' name, Amen.